Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Future of the Browser Conference. I am very pleased to have with me today Scott Jenson. Scott Jenson, thank you so much for being here. You've done so much work on browsers and human user interfaces and really thinking deeply about design, complicating the design process in ways that other people haven't. I really like your approach to the world. I've had the opportunity to talk with you a couple times at a few conferences in the past, and so thank you for being here, and I'd love to ask you a few questions about the future of the browser.
Well, thanks for having me. I'd love to be here.
What do you love most about browsers today?
That's a big question. I think there's a lot to love about browsers. Probably the biggest thing that I like about browsers is their flexibility. The fact that they can run on a $20 phone, and we can even have a new concept like Mighty, if you're familiar, which is a cloud-based browser, shows just how malleable and how flexible it is. I just feel like the browsers picked the right abstraction, and we've been able to take it in multiple directions. The other aspect I'll just say is the fact that unlike most technology stacks, the web is layered. So you've got effectively the representation, the HTML, you've got the presentation, the CSS, and the JavaScript, and each one can kind of innovate independently. And the fact that hello world in the browser is still hello world, even though you probably should wrap it in HTML tags. But the point is that the original hello world still works. Is also so anyway. There's just I think there's something unbelievably resilient and flexible. The browser, I think, is just astounding.
What's the first browser that you ever used?
Oh, well, I mean, before browsers, I was using things like Gopher and Plato and stuff like that. But the first browser I probably used was Netscape. No. Actually, it was Mosaic. No, I was using Mosaic. And I remember it crashing all the time. And it was just like, what is this thing? This is terrible. So it was interesting how kind of humbled the original browsers were.
What do you think is the greatest area for improvement in browsers today?
Okay, I'm going to probably go into controversial waters here, but it's about compatibility. I mean, the web is based on the fact that it's a standard, and the fact that we have this somewhat political contentious issue now about different vendors not supporting full browsers is really quite frustrating. In fact, it's worse than it was in the 90s with Microsoft, as far as one platform trying really hard to use its power to kind of push the web down. And I think, I mean, okay, it's Apple and iOS, and I'm just really frustrated by the fact that it's one thing for them to have a really good browser that they like to have and do, but to prevent other browsers from running is the frustration. So there should be a choice. And anyway, so that lack of compatibility, I think is really frustrating to me. And I've got no problem with Safari, and if Apple wants to do Safari in their own way, I just feel like what's wrong with letting Chrome plus Blink, Chrome and WebKit is not Chrome, Chrome plus Blink actually run on the platform. So that part frustrates me a little bit. And I'd like to see that move forward a little bit more.
What are the risks to the ecosystem in the future by not having interoperability and vendors playing with each other in this way?
Well, to me, the beautiful, almost utopian structure of the web is that it's standards-based, and it isn't owned by any one particular company. So it has much purer motives. And so by not having this compatibility, you're kind of threatening that whole ecosystem. It's a little bit like having a China web and a Western web. We're going to have kind of an Apple web and the rest of the other kinds of webs. So now there are some people, I think, that the thing about the web I find so fascinating is how much we're almost our own worst enemy, because so many people are actually upset with Chrome about being monolithic. And I completely agree that we need to have multiple browser engines. I'm all for that. I'm just reminded of that Obama quote about when they were cleaning up the financial mess. He made this analogy to using a mop to clean up the floor. And he was out there trying to clean, all the Democrats are cleaning, and the Republicans were leaning back saying, you can't use that mop. That's a socialist mop. And just being obnoxious about it. And I think a lot of people are saying to Chrome, you can't use that. That's a Google mop. And they're just kind of upset that it's like, Chrome isn't Google. Now, yes, they're tightly related, and Google needs to be held accountable, and Google should be criticized. And I'm not trying to defend any of that. I just think that the Chrome team is just filled with a whole bunch of do-gooders that are really believing in the open web, and we need to realize that there's an awful lot of good, intentional, standards-based effort there that needs to be encouraged. So anyway, I used to work at Google. I don't need more, but I really believe that their heart is in the right place.
That's great. As you've noticed newer designers and developers coming into the web space, or people that are building new tools and systems and approaches, what is something that you've noticed that they keep missing, some oversight? Have you noticed that people keep trying to do the same thing again and again, but there's something that they're missing?
Well, I think there's multiple ways to tackle that one. I mean, clearly from a design point of view, there's issues, but since we seem to be on a web theme here, I think that the obvious point for me to make is that I don't think people understand how lightweight and helpful the web is. So I was a creative director at Frog Design, and we kept having people come to us to build apps, and we knew that the SEO was going to be bad. We knew that it was going to be hard to buy, things, and it's just so much cheaper and lighter weight to do the web. And so, I think I'm trying to come up with the right way of phrasing it, but like perfection is the enemy of good, and how people are so enamored, or certainly technology people are so enamored with the very latest thing that a native platform can do, they don't appreciate how powerful the kind of moderate ability that the web is. No one's going to say that the web is going to beat native ever, but I guess my point is I don't think people appreciate how good moderate is, especially given the superpower of being on every platform and being easy to install and stuff. So the last thing I'd say is I don't think, even if you do have an app, I don't think people appreciate how even having a moderate fraction of your technology on the web is possibly helpful, because it can onboard people, expose them, and so forth. So it's just like, it's a really lightweight tool. Use it.
Have you found that it's difficult to get people who are very obsessed with shiny new languages and methods to appreciate something over time? Like, do you think that as people go through their career, they go from maybe more short-term to like a long-term perspective?
Well, I think that's, in general, as you get older, you collect mistakes, right? And everybody that's that's what experience is in effect understanding that you're not always right. So I'd like to think that all of us, as we get older, just get more humble, because we've user tested our life and we've done the study. So that, I think, is just a natural process we all go through. So I just, to me, what is always astounding to me is how strongly people feel about certain things. And I just feel like there's room for lots of interpretations. Yes, that shiny thing is awesome. Go play for it. Awesome. But that doesn't mean that everybody else is wrong. And that's kind of my issue is, yeah, you're all right, but don't stop saying everyone else is wrong.
When you were working on Apple's user interface guidelines, what was it like? What was the feeling in the room? How did you get things done? How did that process go?
Well, keep in mind that I joined Apple after the original Mac was shipped, so I was not there at the very beginning. I joined about System 5, so it was at 87. What was astounding to me, and there was originally a Mac user interface guidelines, the phone book version, that came out in 83. It was written right before the Mac was released. So John Sullivan, Laura Kaplan, and I redid the interface guidelines around 90, I believe. And what was amazing to me was how the spirit and the gestalt that had formed had a very strong coherence to it, but it was only after we wrote it down in the form of guidelines that we were able to explain it in a way that made it seem so much more powerful than it was. And it to me, it really showed the power of just giving words and structure to things. Um, the original team didn't need us to do that. They had this vision, they put it together. But when you wrote it down and you put the structure and you added some rules to it, everyone was like, "Oh my God, these guys thought about this all ahead of time." Well, they didn't, but they really had the structure in place, and we just explained it. And I think we were explaining something that was really well done. But anyway, the other thing I'd say is that the Mac really evolved. Like, for example, if you take a look at the original control panel in System 3, it was pretty bad, right? And it had custom controls and really weird rounded rectangle radio buttons and things that today would be completely inconsistent. And then what happened was the Mac also just evolved and it got better. And so by the time we wrote the guidelines, it had significantly improved and become more consistent. So it just takes time.
How do you go about writing guidelines that are kind of scalable, that work when you're not there, and are kind of not necessarily glanceable but digestible? Because I know there's a lot of people out there that do these like privacy and design guidelines, and either it's like this huge PDF that makes no sense, or it doesn't think through the complexities of the world enough and ends up looking like trading cards. How do you balance that and provide depth and interest and focus for something that important?
That's a hard question. Um, to me, I don't know if I can really answer that question, because I think what you're writing guidelines for is 90% of the question, right? Um, we were lucky to have a set of guidelines that we started with, and so we were able to effectively refine. And our big issue was that applications had become more complicated. They had introduced hierarchical menus. People were using command keys. Color was introduced, and so forth. So a lot of what we were doing was to say, okay, there's a lot that the original Mac did that's been kind of pushed out of shape. We need to kind of reset it. So I would argue a lot of it was just simply breaking it down and coming up. Well, actually, in many ways, I'm just going to follow what Brad Frost did in atomic design, right? You create the right atoms and the right molecules and so forth to give people the right pattern language to kind of build it up. And you work really hard to have the right pieces and then the right higher level rules. And then all of a sudden they all fit together. And that just takes a lot of work, because you have to keep refining to get the right pieces. So that type of small, medium, large seems to be, I think, a very general principle that works well.
How do you determine whether something is an atom? How do you know when you've gotten that core that you can kind of make as a principle and build something on?
You know it when you see it? No. No, that's not an answer. That's not an answer. To me, it's been a while since I've done this work, so you're catching me a little off guard. I would just argue that um, we had a lot of cards, a lot of things on the walls, a lot of breaking things down, and it's about, I think, just trying to find the right building blocks. And if something is confusing and it's not working, it's not fitting, you still need to do some work. What I will say is it does feel clearer as you break it down. Yeah, I'm not answering your question. I'm sorry. I just think it's really hard. It's very hard to kind of get the right breakdown. And it has to do, I think, with just trying not to have too many words. In other words, if you break it down and you have 17 things, that's a sign that you need to break it down some more. That's all I'm trying to say. And so you want to kind of not have long lists, and you want to break those down and figure out how it becomes tractable in a glance. It should fit all in kind of a landscape document. If it doesn't, then you've got some more work to do.
Great. That's fantastic. I ask you these questions because we're entering an era lovingly called Web3, and
Yeah.
we're starting to see a whole new specter of interaction models, whether that's a web wallet like MetaMask wallet or something like the Unlock protocol or Coil, and with web monetization, new protocols like Interledger and Protocol Labs with IPFS and Filecoin. So in a way, this era has kind of been compared to the era of dial-up, where there's such a compelling need to get onto the web that you will deal with dial-up in 1993 to 1995. And here, there's such a compelling reason to join this ecosystem, even if it's very difficult, because there's money involved and there's tokens involved, and that might lead to perhaps healthcare data sovereignty or something like that. But what advice do you have, and like what's your experience of Web3 been so far, and where do you think there are the kind of snags that need to be dealt with that people might or might not be ignoring right now?
Well, the obvious one is payment, like you talked about, and a lot of those things were there. And by the way, I was reminded, I helped someone out a little bit on a grant for the web paper about web payment, and we came up with 13 different ways of payment. That clearly does not have the right atoms. That's just far too many. And so to me, that would require further refinements to say, what are the core aspects of payment, like subscriptions, micropayments, and then macro payments, for example, seem to be a right subset of that. And then you'd build the other 13 out of that. So anyway, so web payments is critical. As we've talked about previously, it's the kind of thing that would, I think, save us from this insane ad click monetization that we're going through, where 3/4 of your page is non-content. By the way, a fun exercise is to read an article, measure the actual page size of the article and compare it to the page weight, and you almost always get a low single digit, right? So that just seems like such an incredible waste. So web monetization is a huge one thing. Obviously, identity. I think identity/passwords security is an ongoing issue. I just visited my mom, and she has a list of 18 passwords written down, and just really frustrating. And the other one, though, I would argue is going to be actually the web platform itself. So projects like Web Components, Houdini, and even Project Fugu, I get really excited about Project Fugu, which is about getting access to lower-level hardware, means that the Web3 platform itself becomes more powerful and more reasonable to do stuff. I just don't think people really appreciate that the superpower of the web is interaction on demand. And the fact that with just a click, you can completely change the personality of something as opposed to install, and it's safe and so forth. So the fact that I could have the web on my watch, which I think is completely not known territory and has a lot of problems. I mean, people forget that the web was broken with mobile, and it took about 8 years for us to really pointer events and so forth to kind of get the web back into shape to handle mobile. I wish there was another shock like that, like the web on a watch, so that we would continue to evolve the web so it could handle that. So, but that's the beauty of the web, is it likes being broken and it self-heals.
That's great. Some of these things that you talked about, Fugu, can you break that down a little bit?
Fugu is just a project at, I think it's a web standards spearheaded by Chrome, of course. But it's about getting access to hardware. So things like web USB, web Bluetooth, and so forth are, and in fact, the new game controller API is coming out, so that there is a safe, secure way for the web to get access to additional hardware. That just, because the world went from a single app running on a single computer to a distributed app kind of like on the web, to then IoT type hardware that's distributed. So now you're having like secure firmware running on a small device that's communicating securely over the cloud data, and you've got all these different layers, and the web actually allows you to play in all of those layers.
When you talk about identity, could you expand a little bit more on what you mean by opportunities and identity, and why that's really important?
Well, so much of what a UX person does is you deal in pain, right? And to me, there's just a ton of pain around identity. Just the things that you have to do in order to identify, securely log in. Just the fact that I changed computers and my computer lost everything, I have to re-log into everything else, forcing me to use a password manager and so forth. I have a hack that I do right now, which is every IoT device in my house, I have a Gmail account that is my address, 18 Morton Way at, something, so that I have a separate identity for all the hardware, because when I move, I'm not going to take this hardware with me, and to have it attached to me is ridiculous. So that when the person buys my house, I give them my Gmail account. Well, that's a stupid hack. I shouldn't have to do that. But that's the kind of identity problems that we're dealing with today that don't really work. The other one is just simply the identity as only a single person. So when I log into my Google TV and my grandkids come over, what's Google TV going to show them? It's going to show them Westworld, right? Well, this is a TV for them in their room, yet I set it up so that now it has a mistaken identity. So having identity possibly being more granular and attached to locations, especially as we get to IoT type based scenarios, is more interesting too. So there's a lot of ways identity needs to get smaller and then get better. And there's multi dimensions to this problem. I could go on and on about it, but I'm just saying that we need to get out of the Unix style login command, both because it's painful and it's too monolithic.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I know of Manu Chatterjee, who is one of the co-founders of WebOS, who created that magic Touchstone. And I think later they got bought by Palm. And the Touchstone was one of the only things that made Steve Jobs jealous, apparently, that it was magic, that you could tap your phone, your Palm, to a rock, and and you'd have preferences on it, and it would automatically send that and pair to the projection screen, or that would automatically pair it to your car, and that there was kind of an RFID that would connect to Bluetooth. So you wouldn't go through this menu and click 20 times, tap to pair. And so, of course, there's a proximity, but it doesn't, you could have 20 people in the room, but the person that taps and pairs, if they're authorized, it's more of a cellular biology type situation, right? That you have the channel protein, the identifier protein that matches with this device. We know that. Tap, pair, done. When I'm tapping to pair with this, these are my preferences. When I'm tapping to pair with a presentation, these are my preferences. And so anywhere you go, your WebOS system can interoperate with anything. And I find it funny because every once in a while, there's some of these just really magical, wonderful, no-brainer user interfaces that are so simple. And yet when there's a merger or an acquisition, these things get lost. And nobody's resurrecting them and bringing them back. And so now you have people trying to pair their phone to their car while it's moving, and it's causing them to get in an accident because you have to go through 15 panels to get there. It's kind of the same when you talk about IoT. It's like, well, if you go to your home, shouldn't you be able to tap your Sonos speaker and have it pair to the Sonos, right? Or tap to pair to the light, or whatever, right? But
well, and we're finally, though, I think, getting some technologies that will unlock that. So I'm very bullish on UWB because it can create, obviously, the tap to pair. So people have already talked about the fact that your phone will let you into your car, right? So that's a given, that's well known. But when you start getting UWB in your home, especially if you had, say, a mesh Wi-Fi system, that gives you effectively a trusted zone of space. So think of that as effectively a long WPS button. If you remember WPS buttons on Wi-Fi routers, that was basically a physical button that said, you are next to this, therefore I trust you. It's not high security, it's reasonable security.
Yeah.
So you can imagine with UWB having a trusted zone of space. So if you're in that space, you're trusted enough.
Right.
So therefore, for example, anybody in my house can get my guest Wi-Fi, and I don't need to be involved. We just know that they're in the right. So that kind of identity seems to be really interesting, and these new technologies can unlock things like that.
Right. There's also the issue that I have with, open up your car with your phone, and what happens if it's a really hot day and your phone runs out of battery or your phone gets bricked? Are you stuck outside your car and you can't call for help, right? Like I feel like in blue collar engineering, which my parents kind of came from, there was always this idea of redundancy, that if something failed, you would have a backup. And I feel like there's a lot of people like, I can get into my house with my phone. It's like, why not have a keypad on your door that has a battery that lasts for 2 years, that you can go ding, 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 and be done. And so you can give somebody that passcode if you want, or you could change it from your phone. but it doesn't require the use of this object that you might lose to get into, or just a passcode on your car, that, so there's this idea of, I love the idea of a phone as a remote control for reality until that runs out of batteries, or the connectivity fails or the app goes down, whereas just having something locally, I think has been forgotten for a while as we've gone into the cloud constantly,
Well, I would argue that it's a function of reliability. Like, how many nines do you need? So when ATMs first came out, everybody printed a receipt, a paper receipt, because they didn't trust that the bank actually would take their money. Then after about 4 or 5 years, they stopped printing receipts because it worked all the time. And so my Prius actually has this really cool, the key fob that gets in and out, has this cool little button that you push, and this kind of weird survivalist key pops out. So if the battery goes dead, I can actually unlock the door with a physical key, to your point, right? My understanding is that new Priuses don't have it anymore because the batteries got so good and it works so well that people just didn't want it anymore. So I would argue that as your nines of reliability goes up, you no longer need that. But do you have the nines? And I would argue many companies say that you do and you don't. So we're in this ground where we don't trust people. So it's possible, it's just not always there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think if I got one of those Priuses, I would request specifically the old key fob that has the backup
Yes.
key.
Well, I used it once for a silly reason, but it's nice and it's actually comforting to know that you've got it if you need it.
I think one of the things about crypto investing that people are learning is the kind of data sovereignty and holding their own keys and these seed phrases, and they're owning their own data basically because it's just data. And I find it really interesting because we might see a transition from that to like medical data, that you'd have like a very small blockchain that you own, and then a blockchain that you have publishable events on to a medical practitioner. And then they can share that data for a period of time, write to that blockchain and give it back to you. But that we wouldn't automatically be able to know that unless we started buying crypto and owning our keys. That is almost a rehearsal, a monetized rehearsal that we're paying to develop this ecosystem so that we can eventually own our data again that we used to own in the first place.
Well, and data is a slippery thing. Once it's gone, it's gone. So there have been proposals that you create effectively safe computational environments so that you bring a trusted agent into your data, which then does the analysis and exports an answer, but then the person that wrote that program never sees your data. So you actually have effectively this enclosed environment. That strikes me as a much more interesting future, because then you can have anybody look at your data and it never goes anywhere, but you get the value. So if it exports this person is a good credit risk, the bank gets that information, but the bank never gets your actual details. So that type of computation, because once you give away your data, it's gone. And I don't know how much lead shielding you can put around your data and not be burned.
Right. I remember when we were building that location sharing software, Geoloki, back in 2010 to 2012, we had a series of it was either, your location at a granular level or don't share your location at all. And what we were arguing is that, wouldn't it be nice if I got an alert that said that you were in town? It was just at the city level. I didn't need to know what coffee shop you were at, but the idea that you entered into the region called Portland, Oregon, all of a sudden, and then I would get that note of an event, and you said, share my location with Amber at the city level, and I would say, great, and then I could message you and be like, let's meet up, right? That it's kind of what Doppler was doing too, that amazing user experience startup that was all about you putting your plane details, and if somebody is going to be in town at the same time as you, it will connect you, and you never had to say, I'm going to be in town. But that was also kind of there was that magic era in the Yahoo Flickr era, maybe like 2006 to 2008, maybe even the Fire Eagle era, where some of the best user experience people were there playing and making these amazing APIs and data structures. And I feel like we're due for another magical user experience time like that, which I'm hoping, right?
Oh yeah, well, and Bill Buxton, I think, has said that, almost every big innovation actually occurred 30 years earlier. It just didn't have the traction to do it. So we're playing and we're splashing in puddles. We're trying all these things. And so many of these ideas are visionary but not executable. And so we just need additional, like for example, tap to pair has been around as a concept for a long time, but we actually needed something like UWB to actually pull it off. So we're going to, or same thing with video conferencing. We dreamt about this in the 1980s, but we really needed, the bigger web and mobile web to really pull it off. So we will revisit these things over and over and over again and just spiral into shifting them.
Right. This is why I keep studying what's come out of Xerox Park, because the
Oh
idea
yeah.
that you would walk in the building and by the time you got to your computer, it would just load your operating system, and any terminal that you went to would have your operating system on it and all of your data. That it didn't, it was very much like Star Trek, where you go to your computer and there's your data.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have opportunities to redo that, but I keep seeing a lot of people, especially like recent grads, be like, oh, this is the way it is. It's the way it is right now as it is today, without like looking at the past and being like, actually, we don't have to do it that way. There's been all this research that's been done where we could have, these more magical experiences. But there's like a lot of constraint around, well, this is fundable, this is not fundable, I have to raise VC, these kind of the time locked limitations. So I'm hoping that that there are more people out there that aren't afraid to actually think differently and make things that are 10 times better than the last thing.
No, exactly. And just to go back to your original prompt about the web, if you were to walk up to this device, and you can imagine it being in the cloud, the classic thin client, but as we get more and more processing power ourselves, you can carry your own cloud with you. In which case, I would walk up to the device and it would connect to my device and do it, or it could do a hybrid, some of my stuff and some of it in the cloud. And so that to me is the real magic of the web, is that you can actually have these high level privacy discussions of where the data lives, and it can flow from place to place, and the web just accommodates that.
Totally.
And that's just kind of built into the architecture. You were talking about the Xerox Park vision and coming back to it, and I was tying it back to the web, which is one of the lovely parts about the web is that computation can flow from place to place fairly easily. So initially, the idea was to go to a terminal and it would be in the cloud, so you had a thin client. But with the web, whether that thin client is a big company in the cloud or it's your phone or your box, is kind of just plumbing, and it can kind of move between the two. And not only that, you can actually move to a model where it's even a hybrid, where the majority of the computation is on my device, but then I can have sub-services that are in the cloud itself. And I think that is a lovely set of toys to play with. So the web, I think, just encourages these higher level privacy discussions about where computation can flow in a way that's been solved in many ways for us.
Totally. That's great. What do you think the web will feel like in the next 10 years? I always laugh at these questions, like, what about the next 10 years, as if we can predict this, but
I mean, anybody who tries to answer that question is probably trying to sell you something, right? So all we can do is take a look at the various vectors that we're doing, and just to make sure that those are being addressed. So to me, computation is going to not become infinite, but become very power efficient, very powerful, and kind of ubiquitous. So to me, there's going to be a lot of computation in a lot of places. That implies a lot of coordination. That implies a lot of data. And as we quantize ourselves, we're going to have this data and it's going to escape and we've already seen that happen. So to me, the vectors that we need to solve are about managing multiple computation points and managing the data that comes from that. And I don't think we have good answers for those right now. So this is not what the web will be, but this is what technology should be. And I hope that we are going to start to tackle those problems.
I guess the final question would be, if you had some advice to give to the next generation of people building these devices and services and ecosystems.
Them young whippersnappers?
Yeah.
I just recently gave a talk to some students about getting started in UX. And I gave a small little provocational talk, and then we had a question and answer. And it really brought home this fact that I've had for a long time, that most of technology is not about the tech. And I know this is going to sound maybe a little zen, but it's really about the people. And so the more I've been in tech, the more it's not about the technology, but it's about getting people to all swim in the right direction. So to me, it's very social. It's very coordination. It's all trust building. And without that, you're not going to get any tech at all. And to that end, my biggest learning is that I spent a big chunk of my professional life being very opinionated, to be fair, probably a bit arrogant. And in my latter years, I've learned how important it is to listen, and how when people disagree with you, you know, no is just basically a shorthand for I don't trust you. So when someone says no, that means that you've got to build something, you've got to work on it. And so for me, I feel like those have been the big learnings, that learning how to communicate, how to hear no, how to ask more questions, how to understand, those are the things that will unlock technology more than the technology itself.
That's a really great response. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to seeing you in the future and looking at how this whole ecosystem pans out over time. And thank you for your contributions to the industry in the past, in the present, and continuing into the future.
Let's hope so. It's always delightful talking to you. You asked some hard questions. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.